Well, we are very, very, very humbled and excited to be joined by Anthony Nield today. Anthony is the head of production for the Indicator line at Powerhouse Films. Anthony, thank you so much for making time for this.
No worries.
And Adam is actually able to join us today. So I don't know, Adam, if you want to say hi quick.
Hello, everyone. You don't normally hear me on interview episodes because Chris records them when I'm asleep. So good to be here today.
Yeah, for sure. So Anthony, I guess maybe one of the things that right out of the gate would be super interesting is, if you casually go on because you're interested in a Humphrey Bogart set, when you land on your website, you're going to see Powerhouse and Indicator, and then also Limewood Media. Is it possible just to give a 5 or 10 second kind of background as to what that is and how they all fit together?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So the company is Powerhouse Films. That's the main thing. So if you look at, our email addresses, if you go to the website, it's Powerhouse Films. And then Indicator is a line within Powerhouse Films. Essentially, it's like Powerhouse's films boutique Blu-ray label. And then Limewood is the distribution side of things. So Limewood distribute our stuff. So currently we've got the sale going on. If you're ordering through the sale, it's Limewood who handle getting the packages from them to you.
That's perfect. That makes a lot of sense. Three different legs to the same stool, right?
Kind of thing, yeah. And then Limewood also do, stuff with Second Sight and anime as well. But purely in like a distribution sense. Oh, and Anti-Worlds as well. They also distribute their discs.
Perfect. Thanks for that background. Yeah, I think that's relevant because we're actually recording this during your sale. So I'm sure you can't go into too much detail, but generally speaking, how's it going? Has it been another smash sale like it always is?
Yeah, absolutely. So this one's running for a week. It finishes on Friday, which I don't know when is this going out? Will that be once the sales ended?
Yeah. Probably, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah. One of our week-long sales, we do one every 6 months. And yeah, it covers, all of the releases up until like a certain point. So I think the newest title that you can get in this sale is Columbia Noir 4. And then everything released before that is also available as long as it's in print. We've already sold out of Cisco Pike, and we're bound to, sell out of a few more titles during the sale. But yeah, they always go very well. They always seem to go better than the previous one as well. Yeah, people seem to like our stuff, so they're out there buying it, I guess.
Well, that's a pretty good segue. I don't think it's fair to say that people kind of like your stuff. I think there's a low-key addiction to what y'all are putting out. Actually, I like the way that Adam phrases it.
I have a very important question. I'd like to know how you managed to get the heroin into your box sets, because that's the only way I can make sense to how addictive they actually are.
Well, I think part of it is so basically Powerhouse is a very small team. There's not that many of us. There's a few more. I think like we've gained like a couple of members of staff since I started with them like 3.5 years ago. But one of the crucial things that we've got is all of the core team have worked in the industry for other companies and labels in the past, and everybody's worked as a producer as well. So everybody understands all of the elements that go into making a disc, because they've done it before with that company and this company and all the rest. And by coming together, because we've got that experience, I think we all have an understanding of what it is that people really want. And so that's just what we try and do. I think one of the key things in terms of like if there's an ethos or whatever is that all we are is we're just beholden to the film that we're releasing. So whether it's Things Change or Mad Dog Morgan or a Howard Hawks film or a noir set or a Dietrich set or whatever, we're just trying to do the best by that particular film or that collection of films, and everything revolves around that concept,
It really shows through. I think it, but even down to the artistic decisions you make, like there's a very visually distinctive style. And one of the things that I remember jumped out to me when I was going through the first noir set is that, it's a beautiful yellow box, right? Nice choice of color with that very distinctive kind of one person in action, one or two people typically in action on the cover. And then when I actually got to the movie, the lineup, I believe that's where that image is from, right?
Yeah, C.Y. Wallach, yeah.
Yeah. And I saw that image and then it kind of clicked for the box. So it feels like, there's so much thought that goes into not only the aesthetics of it, but then also, like you said, making it kind of relevant to the film. And I just don't know that there's anybody out there who's doing that combination of aesthetics as well as meaning, as well as you.
Mm. I think part of it is one of the key decisions that was made early on is that wherever possible, and sometimes it isn't possible because imagery isn't available in a high res enough situation. But generally, what we're taking the lead from is the original poster artwork. Because one of the things that you have to think about as well is, well, I think there's two things here. One of them is that obviously a lot of work went into that artwork back in the day, oftentimes with the director involved as well. Or, Columbia, for example, would have, a huge department devoted to this kind of thing. And they knew what they were doing. So because all of that energy has already gone into that artwork, plus a lot of them have the recognition factor as well. So, when we're doing a film like, just trying to think of a good example. Well, some of the Hammer films, for example, then people recognize those posters. They know what the film is. Your job's already done there.
Right.
But then the other thing as well is because styles and whatnot change over time, then if you're looking at a poster, or rather, one of our covers, which has, made use of a poster from a film from the 1960s, that's a film from the 1960s, or that's a film from the 30s, because, we have that kind of subconscious understanding of the artwork, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense, I think. And rather than Adam and I just geek out on how awesome you are for an hour, which by the way, we could easily do. Maybe this is a good time. You kind of mentioned some of the production decisions. So maybe this is a good time to kind of take one step back. What does it mean to be head of production at Indicator Line, within Powerhouse? And what does that job kind of entail on a day-to-day?
Yeah, so basically, my job is, so it kind of starts off that, some titles have been acquired, and I'm not really involved in the acquisition side of things, although, I'll be aware of what's going on. I can, give my opinion and all the rest. But essentially, my job starts when, the films have been acquired. So, for example, we've acquired Mad Dog Morgan. And my job then is to turn that into a Blu-ray. So everything that happens from, from that initial point of acquisition to the point where we sign off on the disc and the book and the artwork, I have to oversee all of that in between. So that's managing, the design of things and talking to Nick, our designer, about how we're going to approach that, which posters we're going to use. Are we going to make it one of our plush releases, which is what we call, the fatter ones in the hardboard, cardboard
Yeah.
slipcases. And then also, making sure that the subtitles are sorted. We have separate booklet editors. So I will speak to Jeff or Beth, who oversee our booklets. We will talk about, who we could get to write the new essay, what kind of stuff is already out there. And then also, obviously, the film itself. Does the film exist in different versions, for example? Therefore, do we need to present, different cuts on the film? We also want to look back on what previous releases have done. Have there been any errors or issues that are fixable, so we can ensure that ours is, a definitive release? And then there's the whole question of extras, of course. So you're looking at what's already out there, who we could speak to now, whether that's, people who are involved in the film or an academic or, an Uber fan, whatever that kind of side of things is, and
Uh-huh.
then also delving into the archives. So on plenty of our releases, we've included short films that are somehow connected to the film in question, or we've found, original production footage. Um, Also, sometimes we find that trailers have never been on previous releases. So we hunt out the trailers and present those for the first times, do new scans of them if we can. We like to include Super 8 versions of the films because that was like an original kind of home video format. And that's interesting to see, how they go through the process of getting a 2-hour film and condensing it down to 10, 15 minutes, for example.
Right.
So yeah, so all of those elements are all going on at the same time, and it's a case of juggling those, but then also juggling that month's releases which we're about to announce, that month's releases which we've just announced, that bunch of releases that we announced the month before, and we're still just in the final stages of, and then also making sure that we're also looking far enough ahead in the future to ensure that everything's ticking over, and so yeah, it's maintaining that bigger picture whilst also ensuring that the minutiae of every release is also, paid attention to as well.
Oh my gosh. That sounds so overwhelming.
No. It's a strange thing. I mean, I think all of us within the company spot, because we kind of come from the point of view of the fans, that we've been watching films for years and decades and all the rest. And we care about each of the releases that we do and whatnot. So there's that thing that people say, isn't there, that if you do a job that you love, it never feels like work. So that's a huge part of it, I think. So even like today on a Sunday, I'll probably dip in and do something because it's a really, really good job.
Well, I want to get into some of the questions around what you just said, but maybe this is the right time to ask, how does somebody get this job? Because it's kind of a dream job, right? I think for all of us that are heavy
Mm,
collectors or kind of in this world as fans, it
mm.
seems like what you do is like the best job possible in this space. Is it, can you kind of walk us through your journey and how you got here? I know you were with Arrow for a while briefly, but anyways, to the extent that you can, just kind of, how did you actually get this?
Yeah, so I mean, I was always into films from when I was a kid, buying film magazines and all the rest. Um, I did go to university to do film studies, but it wasn't really my cup of tea, so I dropped out of that. But then a few years later, we got to the point where the internet was accessible enough that I then started to write online. I used to write for a website called DVD Times. And one of the funny things about DVD Times is that a number of people who contributed to that website in various ways went on to work in the business. So Nick, our designer, he contributed to them here and there. The Mackenzie brothers, David, who does the encoding, Michael, who works at Arrow, they both used to write for the site. John Robertson, who works for Eureka, he used to write for the site. And it was never like a collective kind of thing. Oh, and Michael Brook as well, of course, who we work with and who also works with a number of other companies. Um, and even though it wasn't like a kind of collective thing from that, I think because, I mean, I think from my point of view, that was like a demonstration of the passion that I had for film, but also for physical media as well. And that, because you're writing about DVDs, a few times a week and all the rest of it, you get to have an understanding of what goes into the release.
Yeah.
So through that, I then got just through like the occasional email. Sometimes you would just email somebody about a release that they'd worked on and kind of say, oh, I've got a question about this. Could I have a bit more information on, this side of the restoration or whatever it was? And then through that, I just got to know some people who worked, for example, for BFI Video. And then ultimately, it got to the point where Arrow was looking for a new producer, and I believe my name was suggested by one or two people. And then they just gave me a tryout, basically. I was working from home, working on things like The Fury was the very first release that I worked on for them, the Brian De Palma film.
Sure.
And that all worked out well. That ultimately they took me on full time, and I was with them for, I think it was around about 5 years, possibly 5.5. And then an opportunity came up at Indicator, and yeah, so I just moved on to Indicator, and that was 3.5 years ago now, when Indicator was about a year old, maybe a year and a half. And yeah, I've been with them ever since.
Wow.
So yeah, that's the way that I took it, which I know isn't a conventional way. There was no learning or anything like that. Um, I guess a lot of it was in the right place at the right time, I guess.
No, it's interesting this idea you bring up around writing though, because Jared over at Mundo Macabro got that role because he was writing about world cinema and got connected with the gentleman who owns Mundo Macabro, and I
Hmm.
feel like there is something to be said for being in the scene, I guess, right? And being
Hmm.
around
Hmm.
and being a voice there. I just couldn't help this DVD Times. I couldn't help but compare it in my head to and forgive my French, but the Cahiers de Cinema or whatever the that
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, I wouldn't quite go that far. And like I said, it feels. I don't know. Like I said, because there wasn't any kind of collective decision amongst the writers at DVD Times that we would go into DVD production or whatever. I think it just kind of happened that way, independently, individually. But then somehow, a lot of us have all reconvened. Um, yeah, many, many years later. I mean, I can't even remember how long ago that would have been. It must have been like early 2000s, I guess, when I
yeah,
started to write for them. Yeah.
there's a site that was kind of running alongside y'all called the Digital Bits.
Yeah.
So I would flip between the Digital Bits, DVD Times, and then there was another big one I can't remember right now. But basically, y'all would tell me what to buy from. At that time, the best place to buy online was Deep Discount DVD.
Mm.
And so y'all basically just told me what to buy next.
Yeah,
um,
it was an interesting time, certainly. And there was, I mean, there was so much stuff coming out as well, whether it was new stuff or, films getting released onto DVD for the first time, classics or obscurities. And then, but I think over time through that, you did kind of see the growth of the DVD label, where certain labels were beginning to come into their own, that they were doing, certain things, finding their own niches. So, BFI Video were doing it with their Flipside range, for example. Arrow, soon then became Arrow Video. Second Run suddenly sprung up. And over time as well, even in more recent years, companies like Second Sight, for example, have found their own voice, as it were, that you kind of know what you're getting from different labels now.
So just to jump in on something that you mentioned there, Anthony, because one thing I've always loved about Indicator is how sort of diverse the releases are. You
Mm,
mentioned that you kind of know what you're getting with certain labels, like with Criterion or with Arrow or with even like Second Sight and Second Run. You kind of know their niche; they have their own sort of corner of the market. Whereas with Indicator, I feel like when I look at your monthly announcements for future releases, I never know what I'm going to get, and it's kind of a great thrill about it. I know you mentioned earlier you're not really directly involved with the acquisitions part of things, but is there any sort of insight you can give as to how the decision's made for what you're going to do, whether it's going to be something like Colombian Noir or something really schlocky like William Castle or
mm,
anything in between, basically?
mm. Yeah, yeah. I think I think a lot of labels will have the personality of whoever is heading them up, or
Hmm.
who their main kind of acquisition person is. Certainly in the smaller labels, you see this a great deal. Something like Second Run is almost like Melly, who runs the company, has seen this amazing film, wants you to see it, and he's personally lending you a Blu-ray of that film and saying, "Here you go,
That's
check this
cool.
film out.
Yeah,
It's amazing."
uh-huh.
that's a cool way to put
Uh,
it. Yeah.
but obviously, on a kind of a bigger means. I mean, So within Indicator, I think there's definitely a focus on British cinema of a certain era. I think
Mm,
because a lot of us involved are very much into that side of things. The initial US titles were heavily in that direction with films like Bartleby and The Brute, the Peter Sellers films, and Suitable Job for a Woman. Um, and currently there isn't that much in the way of foreign language cinema, for example.
mm.
So I think we do currently have very much a British roster and a classic Hollywood roster, and are exploring those areas in particular. But then it's also true, and I think this is true of probably any label, that things mutate over time. Sometimes you find out that people are really into that particular thing, which sometimes might surprise you, so you delve into that a bit more. I think our first two Mexican titles, for example, which we released this month.
Yeah, they look great. I'm going to be picking those up.
But those are something a bit new for us. I mean, we've done kind of classic genre cinema because we've done things like Night of the Demon and the Hammer films
Mm.
and uh, so forth, the William Castles, like you mentioned. Um, but
I was
I
actually going to
guess,
ask about that specifically because Phantom of the Monastery is such a great grab. And obviously La Llorona as well. Um,
mm,
but are you going to go deeper into Mexican cinema?
yeah, I mean, I think it's already been announced that there's more to come. But I think there's also that thing where with anything is that if people really respond to that, then you lean more heavily into that. You know,
Sure.
So with the Columbia Noirs, for example, people really, really like those. So we were releasing them once every 3 months, it seemed, for the first four. It always seemed like I would sign off on one and then boom, we're working on the next one, you know. And then we've also got that, after Columbia Noir 5, there's more plans, and I'll be diving straight into those pretty soon. I think one of the other things which is worthwhile mentioning as well is when you're working with certain studios, um, there's always this question of what's available in terms of high definition masters, what can be restored, and what isn't available. It isn't like you have full reign of being able to pick any film you want. If you're in a situation where you're also doing your own restorations, which we're beginning to do more of, that opens up more options as well. But even then, you need to make sure that there are sufficient film materials available.
Yeah.
So those kind of questions come into it as well. So currently with Sony, for example, you're beholden to their masters. Nobody else restores Sony titles. Sony restore their titles. So yeah, you have lists of titles which are available and all the rest to choose from, but you need a HD master in order for it to be on Blu-ray. And obviously you want it to be a good one as well,
Mm.
because I think the fans are much more aware of such things nowadays, that if you are releasing something on a subpar master, people will be aware about it, will be aware of it, sorry, and will talk about it on forums. So you need to be
For
mindful of
sure,
those
yeah.
kind of things.
For sure. I've often heard people say, "Oh, the bit rate isn't very good with this master." I'm like, I don't understand what that means. So I'm just happy to own it. But I definitely
Mm,
there's definitely a lot of people like that who would look at
mm,
it from a very technical point of view.
mm,
And just to pick up on what you said, just from a fan point of view, I didn't get to sort of put it in earlier when you were talking about the box sets and the aesthetics and such. Even what I appreciate as a fan, as a collector, even away from the artwork and stuff, which is obviously fantastic, I just appreciate how robust the boxes actually are. Because I own a lot of box
mm.
sets. It's kind of my kryptonite. And a lot of boxes that I've gotten from other companies, it's very flimsy card. Whereas I feel like I could throw your boxes down the stairs and they'll be okay.
um, Again, I think that this comes in part just from the fact that we're all fans ourselves. So
Yeah.
I mean, I've got thousands upon thousands of discs in the other room, and at least 1,000 of those are unwatched as well, which I really need to work on. Um, but
That's a
because of
yeah.
But because of that, then yeah, because you're handling, all of these other titles and all the rest, you can see what works, what doesn't work, what can be improved on. And because you do want them to be the very best. And also, I think one of the things which has changed since, the kind of DVD Times days, as it were, when we were writing about DVD in at the start of the format, is that whereas once that was the general means of consumption for film in the home, everybody would watch stuff on DVD. You would watch dramas on telly, and everybody would have a stack of DVDs next to their telly or whatever, which
Hmm.
you don't see anymore now because the general means of consuming is streaming essentially.
Hmm.
So what we've kind of got now is we're much more of a collector's market, and because of that, people you want to therefore take care of the collector. So whether that's in the packaging or ensuring that you've got a quality master, or that the extra effort's gone into the book content or the disc content or whatever, it's all part of that same thing. Because the customer now isn't somebody who's just happened to pick up that disc in a supermarket. They specifically want that disc, and they've got expectations, and those expectations are quite high, and understandably so.
But that the legacy that you speak of, because I want to get into the special features because I think there's a really interesting discussion here around how all that's coordinated. But just as a really quick detour, one of the legacy questions I had, which I think is interesting, you talk about how you've all been producers in the past.
Mm,
Back in the DVD days, I used to buy a lot of the Tartan Asia Extreme line,
mm.
and there's a legacy. There's a straight line from Tartan to Indicator as well, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Two of the main staff members in Indicator Powers now both work for Tartan back in the day.
And that was where I don't remember specifically about the supplements there. I'm sure they were okay, but I think it was more about getting some of these movies that otherwise there's no way to get in the US, right? They were so good about bringing a lot of these titles over.
Mm, yeah, it's not something I can really talk about because I wasn't there at the time. I
Oh
mean,
no, it's fine. It's just more of just I think just another point of reference for me as I think about what's going into the company today.
mm,
There was these innovative things being done even back then from Tartan, I feel like, with around distribution and getting some films seen that uh,
mm.
otherwise wouldn't have been seen on physical media. So,
Yeah, yeah. Although I think again that what I was talking about of sometimes you release something and it surprises you how much people were really into that particular release. So therefore, you're looking to doing more. And I think Tartan had the same thing where one of their earliest releases in the kind of Asia Extreme kind of thing would have been the first Ring film,
mhm,
which obviously did phenomenal business. So then they looked in and they did Dark Water,
right.
and so on and so forth. But then they really went into it, didn't they? There was a hell of a lot of stuff that they were releasing, catering for that kind of audience, rather than. I mean, I can remember the whole thing of importing from Yes Asia was quite a big thing in the early days of DVD.
Right, right.
If you had a region-free player, then you could discover these whole new areas of cinema, and I think that was a key thing in terms of South Korean cinema becoming much more having much more of an international awareness. It wasn't so much that, Western distributors, whether in the UK or US, were picking up the films. It was the fact that people in the UK and the US now had an accessible means to them thanks to the internet and, region free DVDs.
Yeah, exactly. And even stuff like the Zatoichi films for a long time, it was hard to get all of them in one region. So you had to kind of have a
Mm,
region-free player to see them all. That's been
mm.
fixed now, but like Lone Wolf and Cub, a lot of those Japanese movies. Anyways, not to go too deep into Asian cinema. It's I feel like that spirit is obvious in the way that the content is displayed and created and then produced. So that was my main point, that just that
Mm.
legacy comes through in many different ways, which is great. Now, I did have a question about the supplements though, since that's where I kind of took the detour on. So
Yeah, yeah.
I think outside of the artwork, and the nice thick packaging that Adam mentioned. These are all very real things. There's another area that people will always call out as being unique about Indicator, which is that if you have a comparable release to anybody else in the marketplace, yours is going to have the most supplements almost every time, if I can think about it.
Mm.
How big of a team is working on that? Kind of what's that like? Who's the one that's sitting there mapping out the supplements, or how do you go about approaching that even?
Yeah, so I mean, essentially every release has one producer.
Okay.
So it generally whoever the producer is, they're the person overlooking that. So from my own experience, I can talk about, for example, the Dietrich box or the Columbia Noir boxes rather. That's essentially down to the individual producer. But there are certain things that have been built up over time, um, especially in terms of archival stuff. So we have, a very good relationship with the BFI in terms of accessing all of those amazing recordings that they've done at the National Film Theatre over the years, for example. We have good relationships with places like the Library of Congress and National Archives in the US. So when we're looking for um, you know, rare pieces of film. One of the things that we did on the John Ford box set when we did The Long Grey Line, we found out that John Ford and the cast had made a promotional film for Bonds, and they filmed it on the set. And you've got, Tyrone Power and Maureen O'Hara and all the rest. And nobody had seen this film. It had appeared in a couple of filmographies in, one or two big books on John Ford. I think Tag Gallagher's, a few others, and we managed through the Library of Congress, no, sorry, the U.S. National Archives, to locate a copy and got that scanned in and presented that for the first time.
Oh wow.
But a lot of these things are easier if once you've kind of established that relationship. So yeah, so we're pally with a lot of different archives all over the place, and we can go to them and say, oh, we're looking for this particular short film or whatever it may be, this particular interview with Kim Novak, could we have access to it? So that's a kind of key part there. And I think whoever's working on whichever release, we have certain kind of go-tos in that respect. But again, it's that thing of being beholden to the film itself. So when you're doing Irreversible, for example,
Right.
then you know that there are certain boxes which have to be ticked in order to make that a definitive edition. So, it has to have both versions of the film. It has to have, the deleted scene that was on previous editions. It has to have the music videos that were on previous editions and that short film and all the rest. We were fortunate in that instance where they'd already made a documentary to commemorate the 20th anniversary. So we had access to that. Through the BFI and our friendliness with them, then we could access the audio from, I've got it in front of me. So there was like a 2002 Q&A that Gaspar Noé, Monica Bellucci and Vincent Cassel did. We could access that. And then Gaspar also did a masterclass in 2009. So we could, access that. And yeah, you just kind of, build it up that away. Again, you're doing it from the fan perspective. If I was to buy an edition of this film, what would I want on there? All you're doing really is just answering that question. I mean, of course, you're also looking at other editions, and making sure that you don't come in second best to those. In certain cases, for example, with Mad Dog Morgan, all we're really doing there is compiling all of the extras from all the different previous editions, because that covers everything anyhow. You don't really need to do anything new with that kind of release, because Philip Moore is all over it and Dennis Hopper is there and Jeremy Thomas and the stuntman and that actor and this actor and so on and so forth. So yeah, but then also one of the things that I like to do, because I think there is a risk in certain instances that films could just sit in the archive forgotten about. So if there's an opportunity to present a short film which was, you know, directed by the same director as that film noir, or starred that, you know, same actor as that, you know, Mae West film or whatever it is, then we want to look into that and get hold of that and present that. And one of the other things as well, which I think is worth mentioning, is there are certain extras which really only exist in a Blu-ray kind of situation. So, for example, on Charlie Bubbles, there's an elaborate scene with CCTV where you see different characters walk in and out in the house that Albert Finney's character owns. And through the BFI again, we were able to find some test footage of that CCTV footage. And through that, we discovered that Stephen Frears, who was assistant director on the film and obviously then went on to become, you know, very famous director because of Dangerous Liaisons and High Fidelity and whatnot. He's the one who's setting it all up. So we've got this raw footage from, you know, this particularly elaborate bit of film, but you would never show that on the telly. You would never show that in a cinema. You wouldn't, you know, pop it up on streaming. It only really exists as a supplement to that particular film. But if we weren't to do anything with it, then that reel would just sit in an archive untouched, you know. So I think there is an element of just wanting to get this stuff out there, you know, and make it more available. That it isn't always just the film. There's a lot more that you can add to it as well. With the film noirs, we included loads and loads and loads of short films on there, either because, you know, there were certain connections, but then also at some point, I just hit upon this idea that with the Three Stooges, we knew that Sony had loads and loads and loads of, you know, the short films that they'd made. And then I can't quite remember how it all fell into place. But I think my first realization was, oh, hang about, they're making these films at the same time of like the golden age of, you know, Columbia Noir is going on.
Right.
But then also knowing that because the Three Stooges would have to pump out, you know, 2, 3, 4 films a year, whatever it was, that they were often parodying what was going on in the culture at the time. So I kind of figured, well, there must be some where they're, you know, emulating noir or whatever. And then the more I kind of looked into it, I was like, well, hang about, we can actually connect this film with that film because it's trying to tell a similar kind of story or whatever, you know. I think like on, I can just get Columbia Noir 2 in front of me. So, for example, in the film Framed, the Glenn Ford film, which is on Columbia Noir 2, the essential story to this film is that it involves a murder plot, mistaken identity, loads of money, and like a malicious blonde. And then there's a Three Stooges film, Up in Daisy's Penthouse, which is about a murder plot, mistaken identity, you know, tons of money, and a gold digging blonde. So you kind of go, wow, you know, that film makes for an interesting accompaniment to that. And it's about looking at archives in a slightly different way, you know, from like a slightly skew perspective, possibly, and trying to do something unique through that. And it just adds a kind of personal touch to the releases. You know, there's like some unique fingerprints on the releases as a result, if that makes sense.
Yes, it definitely does. And I think I heard 2 things in what you just said. The first thing was, for certain films, like let's say Irreversible, the context around the film can be so important, and what the filmmaker was trying to do, and hearing from the performers, and hearing that the kind of, you know, thoughtful questions that were being asked around the release of the film, that can be so important to include, to understand what that was trying to do. Because obviously you can just focus on the 2 really controversial scenes in that movie and say, oh, you know, what a waste of a movie. But if you hear that context, all of a sudden you could appreciate it, much like Solo's another one that comes to mind, where, you know, if you really take the time to listen to the commentary around the movie, you start to appreciate it, even if you don't like it. But you got, you know, you receive a deep appreciation for that movie. And I think, Irreversible is certainly one of those for me that jumps out as a great example of that. And then on the flip side, you have movies where maybe you don't need as much context. Like, if you're watching a noir film, you kind of get it, right? You understand what's happening. However, there's an amazing like enveloping experience that can be created around the movie to really create like it's not just about the movie itself, but it kind of puts it in a particular time, and you get to see like the context more around where it is in history and what was going on, and that can be really helpful as well as a way to but it's all geared towards these definitive editions, right? So there's kind of two buckets I heard in that answer.
Yeah, and I think they're essentially the same thing, because what our job really is the job of a historian, basically, that you're presenting, this particular film or collection of films, and providing that bigger context, that sense of understanding around it. One of the things I always say is that whenever I finish on a particular release, I could go on to Mastermind, the quiz show, and that film could be my specialist subject, because I've learned everything that I need to know about that particular film. And you hope that you pass that on to the viewer as well. But like you say, there are different elements to it. So with the Columbia Noirs, for example, one of the things that we found was that a lot of the filmmakers involved in those, whether it was the directors or the screenwriters, sometimes the producers, were also heavily involved in the World War II documentary filmmaking, and then the post-war documentary filmmaking. And those elements of documentary, bled into the noirs themselves. And even if that isn't necessarily an entirely explicit connection, the process of watching these films with the accompanying short films, I think allows you to build up that bigger picture of what was going on in American filmmaking and American culture at the time. One of the things that we have done with like the noirs as well is obviously you can't escape things like the Hollywood 10 in communism, and Senator McCarthy and all the rest. On Tight Spot, for example, we were able to find recordings of the Senate hearings which were into organized crime, because the film had loosely been inspired by those. And again, that's an interesting thing, that you can present a work of fiction, but then also present kind of like the documentary fact behind the inspiration as well, And again, it just builds up that bigger picture for whoever's watching to just have a fuller understanding of what's going on. I think one of the things which isn't always apparent, especially over time, is just like an understanding of what was going on in the culture at the time. So like at the moment, when we go to the cinema to see whatever kind of film, we can kind of say, oh, they're talking about this thing that's going on in the news or has been going on in the news, and we understand all of that just implicitly because we're living through it. But if you then watch a film 60 years later, you may know that, oh, it was the era of this, that, and the other, but you won't have the same kind of idea that we have now. So if we are presenting ideas which are in parallel to the film or adjacent to it, or somehow kind of loosely connected, then I think that could be quite a powerful idea.
I love that. It's so true, though. I'm trying to think. Well, I guess there's no reason to mention names, but some of the films where like maybe an actor died recently, or maybe they're talking about a geopolitical thing that's going on where it's so relevant. You don't have to be told that if you're living through it, right? But then if there was a famous actor that was going through a scandal in the 50s, or like you said, these Senate hearings or something like that, if you're living through it at the time, obviously you don't need that context. But now so much history has passed since then. It creates that experience of like almost being able to kind of put yourself in the theater seat in that moment with all the full context around it. Do you find that people I think there's this interesting tension, right, between kind of I don't know if tension is the perfect word, but there's this interesting dynamic that happens where people are excited about special features, right? And when they're buying a disc, they'll make decisions based off of that. But I never can get a sense of if people actually watch them all. I certainly do. Do you do you ever get, because you said that you have this thousands of movie in your collection, right?
Hmm.
Um, when you sit down to watch a movie, do you tend to go through the kind of make a night out of it and watch some of the supplemental material, get the context? Is that something that you try to do as you have time as well?
Yeah, I think it works on two levels as well. Is that one, there is, yeah, you're just doing it from the kind of punter perspective, but then there's also the, eyeing up the competition in a way, not like in a negative kind of fashion, but like, oh, they spoke to that person and they're really, really good in front of the camera. So, we must remember to potentially use them. There's that kind of element to it as well, that you want to know what's kind of going on elsewhere, um, partly to ensure that we remain as at doing things as well as we can.
That leads me into a question actually around, you had mentioned before about making sure you have like definitive editions and such. Like,
Mm,
is there a competitive angle to that? Like, I'll use the Dietrich set as an example. It's obviously prior to your release, the definitive release would have been Criterion's Region A of that.
mm,
And then
mm.
you guys brought your own version out, obviously, for the Region B market. I'm not sure if it's Region Free or not. I actually don't know, because obviously I'm Region B as well, as yourself. But is there a competitive aspect? Not necessarily in a negative way, but like you said, just making sure that you're the ones putting out the definitive edition. That if someone needs to decide, will I get this version or this version, they obviously want you to be choosing your version over the other.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think, yeah, like you said, yeah, I don't think it's a negative thing. I think it's more of like it eggs you on, It's
Yeah.
like, oh, that edition's really, really good. We need to do. I remember like when I worked at Arrow, and there were quite a few titles which Criterion had already done. For example, Michael Mann's Thief. And one of the mindsets that you had was, well, let's do more than they did, you know? Um, I mean, it's a tricky thing sometimes. I mean, one of the things is that there are all of these kind of, considerations and all the rest, that you may find out that there's this amazing documentary on, the star of the film you're working on or the director that was made in 1967, and it would be amazing to get it, but you just can't find the film or the rights holder or whatever. So there is this kind of element of luck almost in terms of what you can do. But then, yeah, when you pull that off, that's a really good thing. And sometimes you do have that thing where you're like, I mean, we had it with the Dietrich set where it's like, oh well, we've got this documentary on there, and then we've also got that documentary on there as well. And the Criterion didn't have either of those. And even though this extra is the equivalent of that extra, and this does this and that does that, that's what edges it over to being more definitive. Getting the Harry Coomore documentary, for example, himself a really interesting director, having done Daughters of Darkness, that to be able to present his documentary on von Sternberg from 1969 for the very, very first time was a key thing there. Um, yeah, and yeah, certain things were matched. I think we've both got the fashion side of Hollywood on there. We've both got the audio for the deleted song. But yeah, you're trying to just edge it. Just try and be that little bit better. That if somebody is there, I mean, in the ideal world, they would own both because there's unique elements to each, and there are
Yeah.
standouts on each and all the rest. But yeah, if somebody could only make the choice between one and the other, and region lock in and that kind of thing isn't a hurdle for them, then we want them to buy our edition, of course. So yeah, but yeah, like I say, it just eggs you on just to do that little bit more. Not that we ever cut corners or take it easy on, like if we're doing a release. I mean, especially now where we're doing UK and US releases, for example, where there isn't like a competitive option out there. Ultimately you just want to do best by the film, and that's
Yeah.
what we do.
I think with the Dietrich set, I think the artwork beats it on its own anyway. It's the most beautiful. It's the most beautiful artwork on a Blu-ray I own, to be honest. Well, 20th Century might just edge it, but I prefer the Dietrich films over 20th Century, so I'll give it the Dietrich.
Yeah, well, both of those are interesting ones as well, because neither was the original poster. The
Yeah.
Dietrich image was from a forthcoming attractions catalogue that Paramount had put together, and it was a film which never got made. But
Wow.
because it used that iconic image of Dietrich looking up with the cigarette and all the rest, then it obviously has, connections with the films itself. So it just made perfect sense that it would work that way. I remember we had, a lot of discussions about these things, as we always do. And I could just picture it. I was like, no, she's looking up at the title. And then Nick, did his amazing stuff by all of those typefaces that he found. All of that stuff as well. It's always geared towards being authentic.
Hmm.
So the Columbia Noir typeface, for example, that's the typeface that Columbia used in their press books at the time. We found one for Drive a Crooked Road, the Mickey Rooney film, which is in
Num-
volume.
number
Volume
one.
one, number one.
That's it,
Yeah.
yeah. And so that that was you know the inspiration there. With 20th Century, I think that's a lobby card that we found, which you just saw it straight away. You're just like, well, this is one of the most magnificent images
It's
that
stunning.
I've seen. Yeah, so it just kind of makes the decision for you. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we've talked a lot about the releases become the personalities of the curators.
Mm.
And I know that you said you're not on the curation side, but I am curious when you go to relax at the end of a day or whenever you do get a chance to relax and just watch a movie, what are you typically reaching for?
Um, I mean, I try to watch as much as possible in as diverse a means as possible. So I won't watch, the film that I'm going to watch next to be the same as the film that I've just watched. I think also in this kind of job, it's good to have as much of a general film knowledge as possible. Even if we were only releasing Hollywood films from the 1930s, for example, I think it's still, important to just embrace everything. So yeah, I'm just looking for, something new, something different, something well new to me rather, not as in, released this
Yeah,
year.
yeah, yeah.
And yeah, just to absorb as much of it as possible. Because also I think that kind of thing then does inspire the slightly different kind of viewpoint of doing things. Like I said, with like, the Stooges and the Noirs, for example, it's like, well, no, these things do fit together. It may not be immediately obvious, but there is a connection there. So I think if you're doing that thing of watching a broad kind of palette or broad spectrum of films, then it allows that kind of thinking more.
That's what if I won't pull up my letterbox here since this is not a video podcast, but I I feel the same way. Like I'm somewhere in 2020 for one movie, and then the next one will be a silent film, and then I'm in the 60s for some Italian
Mm,
Poliziotteschi
mm.
film, and there's just so many movies to discover, right? It's just like
Yeah, and every year they keep making more, so it keeps us busy. But yeah, I mean, it also, because there are so many equally excellent boutique labels out there as well, who are just doing their own thing, and they seem to spring up constantly. There's a new one which has just announced itself, which is going to be focusing on African cinema, for example. You've got companies like Era 4444 over in the US, doing like their kind of thing. And yeah, it's great to, to be able to sample all of that. And it gives you quite a diverse, you know, um, what's the word I'm looking for? Um,
well, you have choice. I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but
yeah. Well, yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, yeah, you're not constrained. I mean, of course, the internet makes things easier as well. I mean, when I was first getting into film in the 90s, it was, what I could save my pocket money up for to buy on VHS or, rent on VHS over the weekend, or what was shown on the telly, basically. And there were, four channels essentially. So you were beholden to, the curators of the film programs there. I mean, which was really good because you would have subtitled films on a Saturday night, you would have movie drum films on a Sunday. You could get quite a rich you know, experience of cinema that way. But now it's ridiculous that I can, hear about a film for the first time, find out there was a DVD which came out, 7 years ago or whatever. And I still buy loads of DVDs as well because sometimes it's the only way to see these films. And yeah, just pick up a second-hand copy off eBay for £2.50. That's amazing that we can do that.
Yeah, that's true. We're very spoiled. I remember recently I went through all the Jodorowsky films, and
Mm,
he made this one movie in 1980 called Tusk,
mm.
and it never got a physical release. And in his view, it's never finished. That's why. But and I remember feeling so frustrated that I couldn't find it. I like, but even that concept is even pretty crazy to think about, the fact that, there's this one guy who was, I mean, he was famous to an extent, but it's not like he was Dick Donner producing these big movies back in the 80s and 70s,
Mm.
but we still have these like definitive editions of his movies, and the fact that you can even be frustrated if one of them isn't out, I think it just speaks to how spoiled we are, and which is really fun as a movie fan.
Yeah, yeah. I think it also just shows that there's still so much to be mined as well, especially if you are looking for, something entirely new that you haven't heard of. Um, which, I hope that our announcements satisfy as well. That it isn't like, oh, it's that film and that film and that film. I've seen those, and yeah, they were okay. It's like, well, what's this? I've never heard of this before. Especially something like the Pem and I organization that we recently announced. Nobody's seen those films since they first come out. Um,
I
and yeah,
had that.
there's always there's always those kind of things to just keep going to.
I actually had that page open. I was going to ask you about that next. That's great. I'm glad you went there. Um, I think it's a great example of, because these were, even when they were released, they had a fairly niche kind of market, right?
Yeah, there were three films in total. The first one is like a short mid-length kind of film. It's 40 minutes or so. So because of that, it would only find its life on the big screen on a supporting program, which took a while for it to find. The second film, Assassins, similarly took a while to find, which film it would play with. And then the third film happened the same time that there were pub bombings in the UK. So subsequently, cinema attendances that week were at an all-time low. So nobody went to see the film. And then, they then went off and did their separate things. But I think this is a very good example of talking about, the individuality of certain labels, where because me and Sam, who co-owns the label, are very much into British cinema and all the rest. And I can remember he phoned me up. He was, "Oh, have you heard of these? Have you heard of Pemini?" And I said, "No, I don't think so." And he named a couple of films. I was like, "No, I've never seen those." And he said, "I think we should look into, doing them because the casts, were very interesting, and the ideas behind them, and the fact that, just the idea that a bunch of friends fresh out of film school decided they wanted to make films, didn't really know how to do it, and just kind of went about it the way they thought they should go about it, and were able to pull off these three films. So we ended up tracking down Peter Crane, the director, Michael Sloan, the writer, sorted out the deal and all the rest. And yeah, restored them. But I mean, I never got to see the films until they were scanned. There was still that element of, well, what are these films going to be? But sometimes, you just kind of need that faith. You just kind of go, no, these, on paper, these sound very, very good. And, fortunately, the reality is that they are very, very good films as well. But yeah, the drive behind that is, again, this wanting to see new stuff, even if it is from 1972, if that makes sense. Yeah.
It's crazy that you can nearly anything that you might have seen once on TV growing up, you can almost find it like at least a DVD, if not a Blu-ray. Like there's an example of a film that you'd probably be more familiar, Anthony, than Chris would, because it's a British 60s horror film. And I remember I caught it on Channel 4 as a teenager at very late at night, probably like 12 o'clock at night or something. It was called The Haunted House of Horror with Frankie Avalon. And
Mm,
just completely niche film, like an early slasher almost. Like
mm,
I never thought I'd ever see that film again, but like I just looked it up here and I can buy a Blu-ray of it. Like
yeah,
just
yeah,
nuts to me, like a film that nobody would have ever heard of that I can just go
yeah,
buy on Blu-ray now. It's crazy
yeah.
that nearly anything you see nowadays, which is great for us as consumers and film lovers,
Mm,
that there is such a wide market because it means you get a chance to see all these kind of crazy films that you would never
mm.
thought you'd ever see again.
There was also a thing though where, when I was getting to film in the early 90s, one of the main things that you would do is you would buy the film guides. So, the Time Out Film Guide, Halliwell's, those kind of things, and just pour over them and read about these films. And, you might see some enticing production stills, but you would know that you might have to wait, you know, a decade until you'd be able to see them because, the choices were fewer. Um, and I don't know. I think like back then that instilled a kind of patience in you, and anticipation and excitement. Oh, I'm finally getting to see this film after having read about it 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whatever. Which isn't really the case anymore. You can find out about this film and it can pop through your letterbox in 2 days' time.
Yeah.
That's a
Right.
different thing. Yeah, I'm not
Well,
sure what point I'm trying to make there. I think
We're
I was.
very spoiled, I think is I think that's what we could chalk it down
Yeah,
to. We're very
yeah,
spoiled.
yeah.
yeah.
What one question I did have, I want to make sure if to the extent you can kind of talk about this. I've always been interested in your numbered system because it feels like um, it feels very intentional. Like a lot of the box sets tend to be grouped together where it's possible, right?
Mm,
But then some of the individual releases, you'll kind of jump around a little bit. It seems like the Peminize 138, 139.
mm.
So I don't know if this, again, if this is getting too much into the weeds of kind of what's going on behind the scenes, don't no pressure to answer, but I have always been curious how you think about those numbers and kind of how, the order they're released in.
I mean, there isn't really much to it in a way. I mean, generally, acquisitions will be done in groups. Things like Pemini, which are like a one-off acquisition done with the original filmmakers, quite rare. Normally, you're going through a licensor, whether it's Studio Canal or Sony or Universal, and so that will be like a group acquisition of X amount of films. Um, and then, once kind of the contracts are done and the deals are done and all the rest, and we can start working on them, we need to assign numbers to them. So generally, they just get assigned whatever ones are next. The only time that we've kind of done things a little bit different really is, so like with Colombian Noir, for example, we jumped straight ahead to 300 because we wanted them to kind of be consecutive. The Noir 2 would be, 306 to 311. Noir 3 would
Right.
be 312 onwards. But yeah, otherwise, yeah, there isn't really a great deal of thought. I mean, one of the things that you could probably intuit from it is, how long something's been in the works. If it's got quite a low number compared to some of the other stuff, then that normally means we've been working on it behind the scenes for quite some time. Although, I mean, especially with the pandemic, that just kind of threw a lot of things up in the air anyhow, which it's slowly becoming
Right.
easier to deal with. Especially like early on where we could no longer go out and film interviews, for example, or certain institutions or whatever were closed, so we couldn't access stuff from that archive or this archive. And that all kind of changed. I think actually one of the things which might be interesting to talk about is one of the things which has come through from the pandemic is that people are now used to having Zoom extras or Skype extras or whatever on Blu-rays because this is, if we're going to release, say, Geronimo at such and such a date, and we can't send a film crew to Walter Hill, but we can, access him through Zoom, then that's what we're going to do. And I think over the last couple of years, viewers have become more used to this.
Yes.
But also, I think what it's kind of done in an interesting way is now it's always an option. So if somebody is difficult to get to because they live in a remote, part of the country or whatever it is, or it's just easier for them. I mean, if you think about it, you could be a very famous filmmaker, for example, and it's easier to go into your spare room and do an interview than, that whole arrangement of let's hire a place and a film crew and, travel them there and back and all the rest. It could be an imposition for a lot of people. Whereas,
Sure.
Zoom has kind of opened that up a lot more. And the other thing as well is the technology has improved a great deal. We've seen reviews of some of the interviews that we've done via Zoom, and people think they're just normal interviews, because the quality is good enough. Yeah, so yeah. So whilst the pandemic, certainly had a lot of effects, we didn't release as many titles for the first few months, especially. Um, it has changed certain things in some ways. There have been a couple of unexpected positives in terms of what we can do and who we can access and how we go about that.
There's this new industry that's kind of boomed up in the pandemic here in the US. I'm sure it's global, but um, any sound studio now has become a place where animated films can basically be recorded virtually.
Mm,
And a lot of, anytime where you don't need to have the actors in front of the camera.
mm,
They actually have the ability to, I think there's some of the recent Disney films, even the entire movie was shot in sound studios all over the world. So it's this cool, like you said, kind of this unintended consequence of the pandemic is that now there's this new normal within the industry. And it's cool to hear that extend into what you're talking about as well.
mm.
Um,
I mean, just generally as well, the technology is just very different to how it once was. So one of the things about Powerhouse as well is that there isn't an office. Everybody works from home. Some of us haven't even met in real life even once, um, because of that. I think I've met the vast majority, but there's still one or two, even though we speak on the phone most days and all of this kind of thing. Because nowadays through the technology, you don't need, you know, that kind of thing. All of our discs are authored by David Mackenzie, who's based in New York. But through, Dropbox and such things, I can access everything that he's working on. I can burn discs at home, play them at home on a variety of players, do all of the QC that way. Everything's become much more in reach, a bit like, the films themselves, like we were saying, where you can hear about this film and watch it, the day after or whatever. And that's, I think that's becoming more and more. And maybe somehow, I don't know, this isn't really a fully thought out idea. But I think maybe that, that has an impact on extras as well, that, people can edit at home quite easily now to very, very high standards. We can film in various ways to very, very high standards. And I think because of that, if that's given us more options as well, then it means that we can do more. There seems to be fewer constrictions.
I mean, at the end of the day, if you're getting to talk to a filmmaker or somebody who's adjacent to the film, and you're getting context around the movie that you wouldn't have had otherwise, I think that's the most important thing, right? And so the
Mm.
fact that there's all these avenues being opened up, it is funny you say that though. I remember the first time I was watching, and there was a Zoom meeting on the Blu-ray extra. I remember being like, "Is that a thing now?" But then by the third or fourth time, it just kind of became normal, right? It just
Yeah, yeah. I think the key thing is do you make a decision that you just don't hear the voice of that person on that release,
right.
and to get say Walter Hill, for example, or somebody who's intrinsic to the production of the Day of the Dolphin or whatever, who has so many stories to tell, so many anecdotes, so much insight and all the rest. That absolutely you want to hear those, and yeah, as long as the viewer is going along with you and they're fine with it, then that's all okay. I mean, because everybody's been doing Zoom meetings themselves, people understand it, they know what's going on. So yeah, I don't think it's an issue. I think there were concerns early on, like, oh, can we do this, or should we just make it audio only and illustrate it? But then just kind of quickly understood that you know it's a valid approach.
Yeah, and we were talking about context earlier. Everybody knows why it's there.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
It's
Exactly.
not like that anyone's really going to fault you for it. Um, well, look, we always ask, and we get varying degrees of transparency in this because it's just the nature of the question. Can you talk at all about what's coming up for Indicator? Do y'all are there any new things that would be just interesting to hear about?
We are very, I mean, because one of the other things that we do within the company as well is, so, for example, like the social media is something that we control ourselves. We talk, amongst ourselves, like me, Nick, Sam, whoever else, like saying, oh, should we tweet this out? Is this a good thing to do? We always put the teasers in the newsletters. There are little things like that. When, when No Time to Die got released in the cinemas, I just kind of thought, oh, maybe we could just do a little sly announcement of a time for dying on the same day because it's got a similar title. So you just kind of moved that around. It's like, oh, see this, everybody's, like the hashtag for No Time to Die is trending and all of this kind of stuff. Maybe we should, just pop that out as well. And it's just kind of worked out on that basis. Every newsletter has a teaser, unless there's a sale about to come up, then normally we just tease the sale instead. The current sale, which will have ended by the time this goes out, has a free gift of postcards on all orders over 50 quid, which tease 6 forthcoming titles. So again, it's all very tightly controlled,
Well, everything, there's a lot of intentionality behind every release, which is obvious. We've heard a lot of you speak about it here today, but I think more than anything, it shows up in the releases themselves. It's clear that you're a very passionate person in the way that you went into a job that would just stress me out from a project management perspective, yet seems so second nature to you. So I'm glad you are in the position you're in. I'm glad you're in the seat you're in. And if we have to keep up the titillation and the excitement by just waiting for the announcements, and that's certainly a fair ask of your fans. Adam, anything else for Anthony today?
No, that's amazing, Anthony. It's been great to have you on. It's great to have insight into a company that I love so much. A lot of the interviews we do are with Region A companies, so I don't get to enjoy them as much. So this has been great for me as a Region B person. So I greatly appreciate your time and talking to us.
No, thanks both. No, it's been really, really good. Especially as my first ever podcast interview as well. Very, very good place to start. Thanks.